It's late. The world outside has gone quiet, and the edges of the day are beginning to blur. Maybe the hum of a distant appliance lulls in the background. Maybe your pillow has found just the right shape. There's nothing left to do, nowhere left to be. Only this moment. Only the soft drift of words. Low, slow, and oddly comforting. Some people count sheep. Others let the ocean play through a speaker in the dark. But tonight, or perhaps early morning now, we're going to do something different. We're going to let history, quiet, uneventful, long-forgotten history, gently rock us to sleep. Not the noisy kind with swords and cannonballs. Not the grand epics with sweeping scores and dramatic betrayals. No, this is the kind of history most people skip past. The kind found in dusty paragraphs between wars, behind curtains of myth, far from battlefields and coronations. It's a strange kind of comfort, really. The idea that entire decades passed by filled with things no one would think to dramatize. Moments of boredom, repetition, gray skies, unfinished letters, small concerns that stretched into lifetimes. That's where we're going. The still places between the stories. And if you drift off before we arrive, well, that's perfectly all right. But before that happens, let's settle somewhere you've probably visited before, though only through a screen. You've seen the saloons, the batwing doors that creak open into smoky interiors, the piano tinkling ragtime in the corner, a bartender with a curled mustache polishing a glass. Maybe a cowboy leans against the bar with a drawl and a drink. Maybe a card game's heating up in the corner. Hollywood has given us the image over and over, vivid, dusty, sunlit grit and charm. It's strange, though, how much of what we imagine about the Old West, especially its saloons, doesn't quite hold up to the light of slower, more meticulous history. The truth is that those places, far from being rowdy centers of romantic rebellion, were often dull, dangerous, and oddly pitiful. Not in the way you might expect. Not the kind of danger that snaps into gunfights every 5 minutes. No, something slower. A kind of dampness under the wood floor. A kind of sag in the ceiling. The quiet misery of a man who drinks not for celebration, but because he has nothing else to do, and nowhere else to go. The cards on the table weren't always dramatic bluffs and gold coins. Sometimes they were stained, curling at the edges, played with the same tired gestures night after night. The laughter didn't always sound like joy. Why were they like that, really? What made the real saloons of the Wild West feel more like grim waiting rooms than the glamorous dance halls of our imagination? How did they become places where silence often hung heavier than gun smoke, where the floorboards were more familiar with spittle than spilled whiskey? It's not that the stories you know are wrong exactly, but they're polished, picked apart, and stitched back together for entertainment. The real story is less shiny, but more revealing. And that's what we'll explore together. Not to break the magic, but to find a different kind of comfort in the plainness of it all. Because the truth, especially the quiet truth, is often more calming than the fantasy. In the next little while, we'll walk slowly through the back alleys of those old western towns, not with urgency but with curiosity. We'll look at the real people who passed through those saloon doors, some weary, some bitter, most invisible to history. We'll feel the sluggish rhythm of a day when nothing much happened, when even the poker chips felt heavy in the hand. And all of it will move gently, like a slow-turning wheel. There's no rush to understand, no exam at the end, just the comfort of a story unfolding so softly, so steadily, that it might just carry you into sleep without you even noticing when the world around you faded out. But not yet, not quite. For now, let's stay a little longer in this half-light. Let the idea linger. Saloons weren't the colorful chaos of the movies. They were often quieter, sadder, a little more human, a little more tired. The journey ahead won't leap or shout. It'll amble. It'll lean against a post and watch the dust roll by. Because real history, when you take the noise away, is often just people waiting for something to happen that never quite does. And if that doesn't sound exciting, well, that's exactly the point. It wasn't just the saloons that felt hurried and heavy. The whole world around them was rushing toward something, as if the land itself was trying to catch up with the dreams of the people pouring into it. And dreams, as they often do, had very little patience. The American frontier wasn't a single place or a straight line moving west. It was more like a flickering series of sparks. Small towns appearing almost overnight, like mushrooms after rain. Some would vanish just as quickly. Others would dig in, claw their way into permanence. But most were somewhere in between, caught in that strange state of becoming, where nothing feels solid and everything smells faintly of hope and desperation mixed together. That was the rhythm of the West in those years. Settlers moved fast. Miners, ranchers, drifters, traders. They came in waves, pushed by hunger, pulled by rumor. Land was cheap or free. Gold was maybe somewhere underfoot. There were promises of cattle, of railroads, of crops that would rise tall if only the sky cooperated. But long before a courthouse was built or a schoolhouse even sketched out, the saloon almost always arrived first. It's easy to miss what that means. A saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was often the first sign that a town might be forming at all. Before there were paved streets or sidewalks, before there were banks or churches, there was often a hastily built wooden structure with one swinging sign and a door that didn't always latch right. Sometimes it didn't even have a floor yet. Sometimes it didn't even have a name. But it had liquor, maybe cards, maybe a stove. That was enough. And from that, a kind of center formed. Not a moral center, not a safe one, but a gravitational pull all the same. Picture it, a flat stretch of land somewhere in Nebraska or Dakota Territory, or the edges of Arizona. Nothing much around, just the stubborn sky and a few tents at first. Maybe a wagon with a cracked wheel. Maybe someone selling dry goods off a crate. Then someone builds a crude frame, for posts, some canvas stretched between them. By the time there's a wall, someone's already inside, passing around a bottle. Within weeks, days, even, there's shouting at night and laughter and someone playing a fiddle. It's still mostly mud outside, but people are coming in off the trail. They're tired. Their throats are dry. They need somewhere to lean, to talk, to forget. The saloon answers that need before anyone else does. And so it grows. Some of them stayed that way, rough, lean-to shelters where the floor was just the earth itself. Others grew taller, wider, more ambitious. By the time the railroad reached some towns, there were full bar counters, mirror-backed shelves, and names carved into beams overhead. But even the fancier ones had that same core. Fast, temporary, improvised. Even when the wood was polished, the feeling underneath it was still raw. Because it wasn't just buildings that were thrown up quickly. It was people's lives. Everything felt like it was happening too fast to think about. You might arrive in a town on Monday and be told it would double in size by Friday, or burn to the ground by Sunday. Either way, there wasn't much point in planning too far ahead. That same speed, that same instability, bled into the saloons. They were full of people who had just arrived, who hadn't unpacked their bags, who might leave again tomorrow. And that made the saloons feel like stations more than destinations. Places where things happened, but nothing ever quite stayed. Which is why they could turn so quickly. By day, the saloon might be full of talk. Ranch deals, weather complaints, tall tales told for the price of a drink. But as the sun dipped low, so did the mood. Shadows came early in those places. The more people drank, the more the air changed. Because underneath the laughter was something quieter. A kind of unease. And in places built so fast, without rules, without roots, that unease didn't have far to fall before it turned into trouble. You've probably seen it before. That moment in the movie when the cowboy walks through the swinging doors, dust settling on his boots, eyes scanning a saloon bathed in golden light. The bartender nods, wordless. Somewhere in the back, a woman laughs. A bright, rehearsed laugh, too crisp for the room. The piano stutters out a ragtime tune, and the camera lingers just long enough on the back bar. Ornate wood, polished to a glow, shelves lined with bottles that sparkle like jewels. It's a lovely image. Familiar, comfortable even, and like many lovely images, it was designed to be remembered, not questioned. But the real saloons, the ones built fast and used hard on the American frontier, rarely looked or felt anything like that. There were no gleaming back bars in most of them, no gilded mirrors or soft lighting. If there was music, it was often a fiddle played by someone who hadn't eaten enough that day. If there was laughter, it tended to sound tired, or nervous, or just loud enough to cover the groan of a chair leg dragged over a crooked floorboard. The buildings themselves were often an afterthought, hastily thrown together with unseasoned lumber that warped in the sun and split in the cold. Nails stuck out in odd places. The roofs leaked when it rained and sagged from the weight of snow in winter. Some didn't even bother with ceilings, just rafters open to the dark sky above. Windows were few and small, and glass was expensive, so canvas or greased paper often had to do. The floors, when there were floors at all, weren't the polished hardwoods seen in films. They were usually planks, uneven, bowed, and dirt-covered, sometimes warped enough that chairs rocked even when no one moved. And in many saloons, there was no floor to speak of, just packed earth, scattered with straw or sawdust to soak up spills and worse. Smells lingered. They clung to the walls, to the people, to the air itself. Spilled beer, urine, pipe smoke, sweat, unwashed bodies, rotting meat, cheap perfume. It was all mixed together in a kind of low fog that sat heavy and unmoving, especially in the corners. The bar itself, if there was one, was rarely carved mahogany or anything close to it. More often it was a few wide boards nailed together on top of barrels or sawhorses. The surface might be stained black from years of drink and ash and sticky hands. Behind it, there wasn't a glittering array of bottles, each carefully placed for dramatic effect. There were a few jugs, maybe a couple of bottles salvaged from somewhere else. The liquor might have been whiskey in name only, diluted, spiced, cut with who knows what. And forget about the mirror, that iconic backdrop of silver and carved wood. Very few frontier saloons had anything close. Mirrors were expensive, heavy, and difficult to transport. If there was any kind of reflection at all, it might be a piece of tin or a scrap of polished metal tacked to the wall, more for checking one's face than for aesthetic flair. Even seating was hit or miss. There were stools, some broken, chairs with legs that didn't match, tables that leaned, patched together from scraps. The walls might be covered in crude drawings, slogans, bullet holes. No wallpaper, no framed pictures, just the bare wooden bones of a building that wasn't meant to last. There were saloons that tried harder, especially in towns that saw more money. Some owners took pride in the look of their establishments, and a few rare examples did have mirrors, chandeliers, even carpets. But those were the exceptions. In the majority of cases, reality was far more frugal. Because the truth was, most saloons weren't built for show. They were built for function. A place to get drunk, to sit, to wait, to hide, to forget. If it could keep out most of the wind and rain, that was good enough. And when things went wrong inside, which they often did, it left marks. Blood stains on the floor, bullet holes in the doorframe, a cracked window that never got fixed. No one swept regularly. Trash gathered in corners. Mice and flies made homes where they pleased. It's hard to imagine, really, how far the myth drifted from the reality. The real saloons didn't feel like stages. They didn't shine. They sagged. They stank. They groaned in the wind. And somehow they still filled up night after night. Because for the people who walked through those doors, it wasn't about beauty. It was about having somewhere to go. Alcohol wasn't just a drink in the Wild West. It was a lifeline, a weapon, a momentary escape from the isolation, the hardships, and the bleakness of the land itself. The frontier, raw and unrefined, offered little by way of comfort, and for many, alcohol became the saloon's most constant companion. Whether as a friend or a foe, depending on the hour, the spirits served in those makeshift bars were potent, very potent, and not in the way the whiskey advertisements today might suggest, with smooth, smoky notes and subtle aftertastes. No, this was a raw, uncompromising product, a concoction of whatever could be fermented, distilled, or even just extracted, then watered down and served in a bottle. Many times, the alcohol was so poorly made that it might burn in the throat and leave an unpleasant taste that lingered far too long. But it did the job. That's what mattered. It wasn't about enjoyment in the refined sense. It was about survival. People drank to dull the endless weight of boredom, loneliness, and, for many, despair. The price of alcohol was incredibly low, intentionally so. It needed to be. For the saloon owner, Making a profit wasn't about selling the finest bottle of aged bourbon. It was about volume. A glass of whiskey might cost a few coins, a beer even less. The price of a drink had to be cheap enough for the roughest of men to afford. Men who had little in their pockets but a few hours to kill before they moved on or disappeared. Even the poorest could stumble through the door of a saloon and walk away a little lighter, or at least a little less aware of the misery around them. And because alcohol was cheap, it was consumed without much thought to moderation. The idea of a social drink didn't exist in the same way it does today. Drinking wasn't an occasional treat or a celebratory gesture. It was a daily occurrence, a ritual just as embedded in the fabric of frontier life as the dry, dusty winds that cut through the landscape. The demographic drawn to these saloons was a collection of the lost, the broken, and the searching. There were prospectors who had failed, their dreams of gold slipping through their fingers as quickly as they'd risen. There were ranchers and farmers, struggling to make a living from the unforgiving soil, their livelihoods hanging by a thread. And there were drifters, men without purpose, wandering from town to town, lured by the same restless energy that had brought them to the frontier in the first place. What all these men, and sometimes women, shared was the need for escape. And alcohol, cheap and abundant, offered that escape. It offered a moment's forgetfulness, a temporary reprieve from the hardships of their lives. For the drifters, it might be a way to numb the pain of not having a home. For the ranchers, it was a distraction from the never-ending demands of their land. For the miners, it was a relief from the constant physical toil, the broken promises of riches that never came. But the escape was fleeting. The effects of drinking these cheap, unregulated spirits were far more insidious than a few rough hours in a saloon. Alcoholism quickly became a serious problem for many in these towns. People became addicted, not just to the sensation of drunkenness, but to the numbness it offered. The more they drank, the less they cared. The more they drank, the less they were capable of seeing the damage they were doing to themselves and others. And it wasn't just the addiction itself that made alcohol such a deadly force in frontier life. It was also the way it fueled violence. When men were drunk, their inhibitions melted away. And in a place where law and order were often distant concepts, where justice was often decided by fists or guns, alcohol became an accelerant. Fights started over nothing, over a card game, over a misplaced word, over a spill. And they ended just as quickly, sometimes with blood on the floor and a body to drag out back. In towns with a single saloon, alcohol didn't just cause chaos, it fueled it. With each drink, tempers flared, and with each drink, a person became a little more capable of harming another. The violent environment of the frontier made it all the more likely that alcohol would push people over the edge. Even the most mundane disagreements could escalate quickly when both parties were drunk, and that was a fact that could not be ignored. And beyond the immediate effects, alcohol was a silent killer, creeping in the form of chronic illness. Cirrhosis of the liver, kidney disease, and other alcohol-related illnesses spread like a shadow over the lives of those who drank too much too often. The frontier was a hard enough place to survive without adding self-destructive habits into the mix. Yet, for so many, it was precisely these habits that became their final undoing. Their bodies, already worn down by the harshness of their daily lives, couldn't handle the strain of alcohol's toll, and their health slowly deteriorated over time. Lawlessness wasn't something that could be neatly packed away. It wasn't a temporary absence of order that could be fixed with a little attention or a swift hand. No, it was the foundation beneath the floors of the saloon, woven into the creaks of the bar stools and the deep, shuddering thuds of fists hitting flesh. The lawless frontier didn't just exist outside the saloon doors. It came in with the dust. It lived in the drinks served at the bar, in the quick glances of men sizing each other up, in the shuffle of boots against dirt. And in the midst of this lawlessness, violence became as common as the clink of coins or the scrape of a chair against the rough floor. Gunfights and brawls weren't rare occurrences. They were part of the landscape. In fact, in some places they were almost expected. It wasn't just that the frontier towns had no law enforcement to speak of. It was that the towns didn't care. Or rather, the people inside them didn't care. There were no policemen waiting outside the saloon to handle disputes. No judges or sheriffs to step in and quell the tension when tempers flared. The saloon was the law. When things got violent, the only authority was whatever man had the quickest hand or the toughest punch. Some towns had a sheriff, of course, but in many cases, his presence was barely more than ceremonial. The real power belonged to the saloon keeper, the man who controlled the flow of whiskey, the man who could clear a room with a word. But even the saloon keeper had limits. So, instead of regulations, there was chaos. When a man walked into a saloon and decided to start a fight, there were very few consequences, at least not until a life had been lost or a hand had been forced. Fights could be sparked by something as trivial as an insult, a spilled drink, or a woman's glance. And once the first punch was thrown, there was no telling how far things would go. A saloon was the perfect setting for such violence. People came there to forget their lives, but all too often, they ended up remembering them in the worst way. When men and women were under the influence of alcohol, their judgment weakened, and their tempers became razor-thin. Words were more likely to be shouted than whispered. Small grievances, quickly exaggerated, bubbled over into physical confrontations. In these volatile environments, fights could escalate quickly into gunfights. The notorious incidents are often painted with a sense of glory in popular memory, the lone gunslinger facing down a rowdy crowd. But in truth, these gunfights were chaotic, messy affairs. The violence didn't look like it did in the movies. People weren't cool-headed sharpshooters, moving with precision and purpose. They were desperate, frightened, and often drunk. Guns went off unpredictably, and innocent people were just as likely to end up caught in the crossfire as the intended target. A bar fight could quickly spiral into a deadly shootout, the air thick with smoke and confusion. One of the most famous examples of this kind of violence was the gunfight at the OK Corral, which has been romanticized over and over in film and literature. The reality, however, was far different. The gunfight itself wasn't just a moment of tension. It was the culmination of weeks of bickering, accusations, and territorial disputes that had poisoned the town. It wasn't just two groups of men squaring off in the middle of the street. It was a brewing storm, with the saloon as one of its primary battlegrounds. There were guns, yes, but there was also deep, simmering rage built up from constant slights, insults, and tensions, much of which had started inside those saloons. When the violence didn't involve guns, it often took the form of bare-knuckled brawls. Fists flew, tables were overturned, and chairs were smashed against walls. The fights were messy, brutal affairs, where the goal wasn't victory but survival. Men didn't fight for honor, they fought because it was the only way to release the tension that had been building up. In a town where there were few rules and no safety net, a man's pride could be the difference between life and death. Losing face could mean losing respect, and that could be a fatal blow to one standing in a small, isolated community. Not every fight led to death, but many did. And for those who didn't perish in the violence, the scars, both physical and psychological, lasted long after the dust settled. Perhaps the most tragic part of these bar fights wasn't the violence itself, but what they represented. The truth was that these fights didn't end anything. They simply reset the tension, allowed it to build again. And so the violence repeated itself, each time with no resolution, no sense of justice, no possibility of peace. The real cost of these bar fights wasn't always visible in the blood or the bruises. It was in the way these acts of lawlessness seeped into the very fabric of the towns themselves. Families were torn apart when men didn't come home from these fights. Businesses were ruined when owners were killed in brawls. And, perhaps most tragically, it was the sense of lawlessness that set the tone for how people lived and how they died. When violence was allowed to be a part of everyday life, it became something as common and as unremarkable as a man's boots on the saloon floor. Gambling was a way of life for many on the frontier. Not just a pastime, but a dangerous and often destructive pursuit that promised riches to the lucky and ruin to the unwary. In the flickering candlelight of a saloon, poker games spilled across tables, surrounded by a haze of smoke and the muffled conversations of men who would bet their last coin for the chance at something more. The stakes were always high, but the risks weren't always visible, because many of those games were rigged before the first hand was dealt. It wasn't uncommon for saloon owners to line their pockets with the winnings of games that were, from the start, designed for failure. Cheating was an open secret. Dealers marked cards. Players used sleight of hand to switch chips, palm cards, or deal themselves the best hand. And for the most part, no one cared. Everyone knew the rules of the game. There were no rules. What mattered was who could cheat the best and who had the quickest eye to catch another in the act. It wasn't just the players who were vulnerable. The very system of gambling on the frontier was built to deceive. Behind the poker tables, the games were stacked against the hopeful miner or the weary rancher, looking for an escape from the weight of their daily lives. For those who came in with only their luck to guide them, there was nothing to do but play. Some knew their odds, some didn't, but for all of them, the outcome was already written. The saloon owners and their crooked dealers held all the cards, literally. There was something almost poetic about it, the way the gamblers would settle in with the belief that this game, this hand, would be the one that finally changed their fortunes. But it never was. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how many pots they won or lost, the house always won in the end. The unspoken truth was that for every gambler who walked away with riches, there were a dozen who lost everything, their pockets emptied and their spirits crushed. But this was the way of life on the frontier, where everything had a price, and where men often gambled with more than just money. It was a place where fortunes could be made in an instant, but where the house always had the edge. For the prospectors who came to town with hopes of striking it rich, the poker tables were often their first stop and their last. The stakes at the tables were always higher than the money on the surface. Each hand was a gamble not just for dollars but for dreams. A prospecting man with a heart full of hope, standing on the precipice of despair, would find himself drawn to the table, each bet representing a wish for something better. Perhaps the mine wasn't yielding as expected. Perhaps the weather had been unkind. Whatever the reason, the poker table offered an illusion, a brief, tantalizing vision of escape. For many, it was a last-ditch effort to find meaning, to grab hold of something that might finally change their fate. But it was all an illusion, carefully constructed by the players behind the scenes. The dealer was never impartial. The game wasn't about fair play. It was about weaving a web of deception, luring the desperate and the hopeful into a trap they would never escape. Cards were shuffled not just to mix the deck, but to ensure the right hands ended up in the right pockets. The rich, well-connected gamblers knew how to mark cards, how to distract the dealer, how to slip extra chips into their pile when no one was looking. It was an art, really, an art of lies and deceit played out with every shuffle and deal. Prospectors, the men who had spent their days digging in the earth and their nights dreaming of gold, were particularly vulnerable. Their savings, often the sum of years of hard labor, were just a moment away from being taken. For these men, who had spent months or even years staking their hopes on an uncertain future, the promise of easy money at the poker table was too alluring. They didn't stop to think about the cards they were being dealt. They didn't question the slow, deliberate way the dealer moved, or the glint in the eyes of the other players. All they saw was the chance to break free from their hardships, the promise that maybe, just maybe, this game would be the one where luck would smile upon them. But when the cards were laid down, there was no luck. There was only the certainty of defeat. The dealer had won again. The gambler had lost. But it wasn't just their money that was gone. It was their spirit, their dreams, their hopes for something better. With each hand, the cycle repeated: hope, defeat, and despair. The poker tables had become a microcosm of life on the frontier itself, an endless cycle of striving for something just beyond reach, only to have it snatched away. The ruin of countless prospectors could be traced to these games. They came to town with their dreams, their savings, their stories of potential fortune, and they left with nothing but empty pockets and broken hearts. Some wandered off, back into the wilderness, only to fade into history, their names forgotten. Others lingered, wallowing in their loss, finding solace in another round of poker, hoping against all odds that this time would be different. But it never was. The saloon was not just a place for games, alcohol, or fights. It was also a social stage, a carefully constructed space where people lived out their most desperate desires and darkest impulses. The dynamics inside these places were complex, shaped by both the men who came to drink, gamble, and fight, and by the women who, too often, found themselves trapped in a world of exploitation. Women in the saloons were far more than just customers. They were, for the most part, commodities. Their roles were as varied as the saloons themselves, but the majority were forced into one of two categories: dancers or prostitutes. Both roles came with their own burdens, and both were governed by the same rules. Rules that offered little in the way of autonomy and even less in the way of protection. The women who danced in saloons often had no choice in the matter. They were typically young, often orphaned or abandoned, with few options available to them. Some had come west in search of better opportunities, hoping for a life outside the confines of overcrowded, oppressive cities. But the frontier was no place for those unprepared to face its harshness, and these women soon found themselves on the margins of society, forced to entertain men who sought more than just a glimpse of their beauty. For some, dancing was a way to make money, to survive in a world that offered little else. But the price of that survival was high. They were expected to perform for the pleasure of men who didn't see them as people, but as objects of lust. In some cases, the women's dances were the only thing that separated them from the fate of the many prostitutes who worked the same saloon floors. They danced, but they were still bound by the same unspoken rules. Rules that kept them at the mercy of the men who paid for their time. And when the dancing ended, they were often pushed into more intimate roles, sometimes without their consent, sometimes because they had nowhere else to turn. For these women, every day was a survival game. Their worth was measured by their ability to please, their ability to keep the men coming back. But behind their painted faces and carefully constructed smiles, they were often just as broken as the men they entertained. Their lives were filled with fleeting moments of escape, but no amount of whiskey or laughter could ever wash away the pain of their reality. Many of these women were forced to turn to prostitution to make ends meet, moving from dance floor to bed, from customer to customer, in a never-ending cycle of exploitation. Prostitution was often seen as a step down from dancing, a deeper plunge into the darkness of frontier life. It wasn't just about the money, it was about survival. The saloon's prostitute was as much a part of the fabric of the place as the tables, the whiskey, or the games. She worked not just with her body but with her spirit, performing for men who had little regard for her humanity. And like the dancers, the prostitutes were often trapped, tied to the saloon, tied to the rough men who held the power to make or break their lives. But not every woman in the saloon was coerced into these roles. Some were there by choice, but that choice was not always freely given. The frontier was a place where opportunity was scarce, especially for women. There were no guarantees of safety, no systems in place to protect those who fell through the cracks. And so, many women entered the saloon world, either because they were drawn by the promise of excitement or because they saw it as their only option. Some sought out saloons as a way to find companionship, a sense of belonging in a world that otherwise rejected them. But even those who chose to work there found that the price of belonging was high, and often deadly. For the men who frequented the saloons, camaraderie was a part of the appeal. The saloon was a place where bonds were forged, alliances made, and friendships built. But these relationships were not always what they appeared to be. The rough, often brutal atmosphere of the saloon could turn even the most basic of friendships into volatile alliances, subject to the same whims and dangers as the rest of frontier life. In a place where alcohol flowed freely, where emotions were raw and tempers were thin, camaraderie could easily devolve into violence. Friendships formed in the heat of a drink or in the shared excitement of a poker game often turned sour in a moment of anger or betrayal. And in a saloon, betrayal wasn't just a matter of broken trust. It was often a matter of life and death. A fight that started as a simple argument could escalate into a deadly showdown in the blink of an eye. The shared bond of men in a saloon was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a misstep, an insult, or an unexpected loss at the poker table. The roughness of male camaraderie in the saloon was not limited to brawls or gunfights. It also manifested in the cruelty that men sometimes displayed towards the women in their midst. The social dynamics of the saloon often created a space where violence against women was normalized, even expected. The women, after all, were there to serve the men's desires, whether that meant dancing, entertaining, or offering themselves in more intimate ways. Men in the saloon saw themselves as entitled to the women's bodies, their attention, and their time. But these women were more than just their roles as objects of desire. They were, in their own right, survivors, forced to navigate a world that saw them as disposable but still finding ways to endure. Many women found solace in one another, forging bonds in the back rooms of the saloon, where their lives, too, had a rhythm of survival and of quiet rebellion. They may have danced and they may have been forced into prostitution, but they were not merely victims of the men who frequented the saloons. They had lives outside of the work they performed, and in that private space they held on to what little power they had. The saloon was a place of many things: laughter, anger, games, fights, but also of a hidden, creeping illness that was no less deadly than the guns drawn in brawls. Behind the clinking of glasses, the shuffle of cards, and the desperate attempts to forget the hardships of life, there existed a quieter, more insidious threat. It was a threat that lingered in the murk of the unsanitary conditions, in the tainted water, the air thick with disease, and in the very walls of the saloon itself. The frontier, for all its promises of opportunity and adventure, was rife with illnesses, and the saloons, often the busiest places in town, were breeding grounds for contagion. Water, the most essential and most easily contaminated of resources, was often scarce and dirty. In a time before the wide availability of modern plumbing, many saloons relied on local wells or nearby rivers for their water supply. But these sources were rarely treated or filtered. Rivers that meandered through towns were often polluted by waste, runoff, and the very human activity that thrived in frontier settlements. The same water used to quench the thirst of miners and cowboys, to make the drinks that flowed freely in saloons, was often the same water that had been contaminated by the mess of human life. Saloons would use this water to mix drinks, to wash glasses, to refill water pitchers, but more often than not, it was this very water that carried diseases. Contaminated water became a silent killer, spreading cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever among the patrons who never thought to question its source. In some cases, it wasn't the alcohol or the games that were the most dangerous aspect of a night in the saloon. It was the water itself. This was particularly true in the early days of frontier life, when sanitation practices were minimal at best. Even as towns grew, their water systems failed to keep up with demand, and many saloons would simply rely on the local sources, regardless of how unsanitary they were. Patrons were unaware of the risks. They came to drink, to relax, to forget about the brutal realities of the frontier. But their enjoyment came at a cost. For the frontier's population, a simple drink could easily lead to sickness, and the saloons, often the heart of town life, became places where disease spread quickly. But water wasn't the only source of contamination in these spaces. The air itself was thick with disease, especially in the crowded, poorly ventilated saloons where tobacco smoke mixed with the scent of sweat and unwashed bodies. Tuberculosis, often referred to as consumption in the era, was rampant across the frontier, and the saloons served as its ideal incubator. Men and women who had contracted the disease, perhaps without even knowing it, would mingle with others, spreading the disease in a confined space where the air could never be fully cleaned. It wasn't uncommon to find someone coughing violently in the corner of a saloon, their face pale, their chest rattling with the harsh coughs that heralded the disease's arrival. Tuberculosis, with its slow, painful progression, would often ravage the bodies of its victims, sapping them of energy and strength until they were too weak to do anything but linger in the smoke-filled rooms of the saloon. The disease would spread quickly in such an environment, where proximity was inevitable, and where people remained in close quarters for hours, breathing the same thick air. Those who suffered from tuberculosis in a saloon didn't have access to the medicines or treatments that might have alleviated their suffering. In fact, most people on the frontier had little access to healthcare at all. The rugged nature of frontier life often meant that there were no doctors within reasonable distance, and when there were, their practices were primitive at best. Some had little more than rudimentary knowledge of diseases, and even less means of addressing them. In this way, tuberculosis was an invisible killer, one that often went unnoticed until it had already spread through an entire saloon, laying waste to the bodies of those unfortunate enough to be infected. This disease wasn't alone. The saloon environment, with its mix of sweat, smoke, and poor sanitation, also made it a prime breeding ground for a host of other illnesses. The cold, damp floors that were rarely cleaned became a source of infection, as did the overcrowded restrooms that could barely accommodate the needs of the saloon's busy clientele. Unsanitary conditions were everywhere. Patrons would often track mud, dirt, and filth from the street into the saloon, bringing with them bacteria and germs that would quickly take root in the unsanitary environment. Even the basic act of using the restroom in a saloon posed a risk. Facilities were often inadequate, and hygiene was a low priority. Without proper plumbing, many saloons relied on outhouses or rudimentary latrines that were often poorly maintained. The stench of human waste would fill the air, mingling with the smoke from tobacco and the staleness of overcrowded spaces. Those who were unfortunate enough to find themselves using these facilities would often leave with more than just a sense of discomfort. They would leave with the germs and bacteria that festered in these unsanitary conditions. This situation was worsened by the high turnover rate of people in these saloons. Frontier life was transient. Miners, cowboys, travelers, and traders passed through towns constantly. The people who entered these saloons often came from areas where hygiene was less than ideal, carrying with them new strains of disease that could easily spread to others. It wasn't unusual for entire towns to be struck by epidemics after a particularly rough winter, when the saloons had been packed with travelers and disease had found its way into the mix. The effects of such environments on public health were devastating. Entire communities would suffer as illnesses spread unchecked, with the saloon acting as both the cause and the consequence of that spread. The grim reality was that the saloon, supposedly a place of respite and escape, was often the very place where death would quietly claim its victims. In the shadow of the saloon, beneath the clinking glasses, the heated arguments, and the bitter smell of sweat and alcohol, there was another reality, one of power, greed, and exploitation. The saloons, often painted in romantic hues by Hollywood, were, in truth, little more than instruments of exploitation. Those who operated within these establishments, whether they owned them, managed them, or worked in them, were caught in a web of economic systems that profited off the suffering, the chaos, and the very human desperation that defined frontier life. At the heart of this economic machinery were the saloon owners themselves. These individuals, whether they ran a single establishment or several across a wide swath of land, held immense power over the lives of those who worked for them and the people who frequented their establishments. Many saloon owners were shrewd businessmen who saw the chaos of the frontier not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be seized. They built their businesses on the foundation of vice, and in doing so, they profited from the very elements that made frontier life dangerous and unstable. For these owners, the saloon was more than a place of entertainment. It was a machine for extracting money from the poor, the desperate, and the unruly. They understood the value of alcohol, not just as a commodity, but as a tool for controlling behavior. The saloon became a place where people could forget their hardships, a place where the heavy weight of the frontier's brutal realities could be momentarily lifted. But behind this facade of enjoyment and escape, the owners knew that the more people drank, the more they spent, and the more they drank, the more they lost. Alcohol was the hook, the bait that kept men coming back for more. The relationship between saloon owners and their workers was one of economic dependency and exploitation. The workers, the bartenders, the dancers, the prostitutes, were all at the mercy of their employers. Bartenders often had to work long hours in terrible conditions, dealing with rowdy, sometimes violent customers. They were the frontline soldiers in the daily chaos of the saloon, yet their compensation was minimal at best. Most were paid in small wages or tips, often barely enough to live on. Some were lucky enough to receive room and board, but this was far from a guarantee. The power of the saloon owner in these arrangements was absolute. They could, and often did, manipulate the wages and conditions of their employees to maximize their own profit. A bartender might work all day and night, only to find their wages barely enough to cover the cost of a meal and a place to sleep. The dancers and prostitutes had it even worse. For them, the economic system was one of total dependence. Their bodies were the currency in the transaction, and they had little say in how the business was run. Dance hall girls, in particular, were often forced to perform for long hours, sometimes at the beck and call of the saloon's owner, sometimes in front of dozens of drunk and rowdy men. These women rarely had any other way to make a living. Few had the skills, education, or connections to find work outside the saloon. And the work they did inside it was grueling and degrading. The women in these establishments were often promised a cut of the tips or a share of the earnings from the rooms they rented out to men, but in many cases this promise was hollow. Saloon owners often took advantage of the vulnerable nature of these women, charging exorbitant fees for their lodging, food, and clothing. Prostitutes, in particular, had little hope of escaping the cycle of exploitation. They were trapped not just by the men who used their bodies, but by the system itself. The saloon owner, who might have appeared as a charismatic businessman or a respectable entrepreneur to the outside world, was in fact the architect of their suffering. But the saloon owners weren't the only ones profiting from the chaos. Land speculators and corrupt lawmen also played crucial roles in maintaining the exploitation that flourished in these spaces. Land speculators were often the ones who saw the rapid expansion of towns and settlements as an opportunity to buy up land at rock-bottom prices, only to sell it later for a much higher profit. The saloon was a key player in this scheme. These speculators knew that the more saloons they could help establish, the more people they could attract to the area, and the higher the value of the land would rise. It wasn't just the saloon owners who profited from the chaos. The land around the saloon became a commodity to be bought and sold, and those who were savvy enough to play the game could walk away with fortunes. Corrupt lawmen were another essential piece of this puzzle. Frontier law was often a patchwork system at best, and in many places, the lawmen who were supposed to uphold order were the very people who contributed to the lawlessness. These lawmen were often paid off by saloon owners, land speculators, or gamblers to turn a blind eye to the violence, the cheating, and the corruption that ran rampant in these establishments. Instead of protecting the workers and patrons of the saloon, many lawmen acted as enforcers, using their power to ensure the system remained intact. For the saloon owners and their partners in crime, this system of exploitation and corruption worked beautifully. They profited off the chaos, using the frontier's instability to their advantage. But for the workers, the bartenders, the dancers, and the prostitutes, life was a constant struggle to survive in a world that offered no hope of escape. By the time the smoke began to settle over the frontier towns, when the saloons had carved their place into the daily fabric of life and their owners had grown bold in their profits, there was already a quiet murmur rising in the distance. It didn't sound like a gunshot or the chaotic roar of a late-night brawl, but it carried something equally disruptive, a determined cadence that promised to reshape the world these saloons had claimed for themselves. It came not from the gamblers or the speculators, nor from the lawmen who had long since sold their silence, but from a different kind of force. A force less violent but no less powerful. A force that spoke not through fists or fire, but through sermons, petitions, and relentless conviction. The early echoes of reform emerged as whispers, church meetings in small wooden halls where townspeople gathered to pray, to worry, and to hope. They had watched as the saloons expanded, as more men succumbed to drink, as more women were pulled into lives of degradation, and as families collapsed under the weight of addiction and vice. To the reformers, the saloon was more than just a place, it was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the frontier promise. Where there should have been growth and decency, there was instead chaos and corruption. And so they began to push back. Temperance, at its core, was a movement built on restraint, on the belief that alcohol was the root of moral decay. But it was also more than that. It was a strategy, a carefully organized response to the disorder that had come to define much of frontier life. Women, especially, took a leading role in these efforts. Many had suffered firsthand the impact of saloons on their homes. They had seen wages disappear into whiskey bottles, had waited up through the night for husbands who never returned, or returned broken and bruised. Their fight against saloons wasn't abstract, it was survival. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, founded in the 1870s, became one of the most visible and persistent forces in this battle. Through pamphlets, prayer circles, and organized marches, they made the saloon not just a place of vice, but a political target. Their message was clear and unwavering. Saloons destroyed families, robbed children of their futures, and weakened the very foundation of American society. They called not only for abstinence from alcohol, but for the closure of the saloons themselves, those places where the suffering seemed to concentrate and multiply. And they weren't alone. Religious leaders across denominations added their voices to the growing call for reform. Traveling ministers on horseback, known as circuit riders, brought sermons to isolated frontier towns, denouncing the saloon as a den of sin. In towns with little more than a post office and a general store, they preached in tents or borrowed barns, urging congregants to vote dry, to resist temptation, to stand firm in the face of moral ruin. These messages were simple but compelling. They offered something the saloon could not: a sense of hope, purpose, and salvation. The strategy of these reformers was multifaceted. In some towns, they worked to persuade local councils to refuse licenses to new saloons, a tactic known as local option laws. In others, they lobbied for increased policing and regulation, arguing that if the saloon could not be eliminated, then at least its most harmful excesses could be contained. But the most determined among them believed nothing short of full prohibition would suffice. They wanted the saloons gone. Not reformed, not softened, but shut down entirely. By the 1890s, these efforts were gaining real momentum. The saloon, once untouchable, began to feel pressure. In some towns, saloons were forced to reduce their hours, close on Sundays, or ban gambling outright. Reformers celebrated these victories, no matter how small. Every closed saloon door was a step toward a better world, or so they believed. And as more communities went dry, the political landscape began to shift. Politicians, always attuned to the winds of public sentiment, began to align themselves with temperance platforms. Some did so out of genuine conviction. Others, more cynically, saw a path to votes through the pulpit. Either way, the result was the same. The saloon, once defended by power and profit, was now under siege from the very society it had once dominated. Reformers used newspapers, public speeches, and symbolic acts, such as hatchet-wielding protests led by figures like Carrie Nation, to keep the pressure high. These dramatic gestures, though sometimes dismissed as fringe theatrics, drew national attention and helped galvanize the growing support for prohibition. And it wasn't just women and clergy. Businessmen too, especially those invested in a more stable and sober workforce, began to see the saloon as an economic liability. They had grown tired of lost productivity, of workers arriving drunk or not at all. Factory owners and rail executives quietly joined the temperance cause, funding campaigns and endorsing legislation aimed at limiting alcohol's reach. What began as a moral crusade soon acquired economic weight. The tide was turning. And so, with the last of the saloon doors creaking closed under the watchful eyes of reformers and the slow-turning wheels of legislation, the story draws to its quieter end. Not with a bang, not with a heroic standoff at high noon, but with the soft, inevitable hush of fatigue. The Wild West, or what was left of it, had finally begun to sleep too. The myths, though, they never needed rest. In the minds of generations that followed, the saloon became more than a building. It was a stage set in amber light, a place where legends played their parts beneath the low hum of a piano and the steady clink of glasses. We've seen it hundreds of times, in films, on book covers, in the illustrations of dime novels that promise glory and danger in equal measure. The wood always gleamed, the bar was always polished, the whiskey was always smooth. The men were brave, the women mysterious, and the danger exciting rather than fatal. But that, as you've seen, was never quite the truth. The real saloons of the frontier didn't sparkle. Their floors were sticky and stained, their air foul with smoke, sickness, and the sour dregs of cheap liquor. The people who passed through their doors weren't just card sharps and gunslingers. They were exhausted men, broken men, women with nowhere left to turn, children who grew up watching violence become a nightly ritual. The stories we inherited were cleaned up, scrubbed raw of the human grime that soaked into every corner of those dimly lit rooms. Still, the myth endured. It endures even now, because the fantasy is easier to carry. It weighs less than the reality. It asks nothing of us. Not our discomfort, not our reflection, not our sympathy for those who never made it out of the saloon's grasp. In the legend, the gunslinger gets the girl. The gambler always has an ace up his sleeve. The bartender is a sage with a shotgun under the counter. No one limps home drunk and penniless. No one coughs blood behind a curtain. No one is trapped behind the swinging doors, waiting for a better life that never arrives. But if there's something gently satisfying in peeling back that illusion, something grounding in recognizing that behind every frontier myth lies a real human cost, then perhaps that's where our journey can finally settle down. We've wandered through dust and noise and shadow. We've looked under the floorboards of frontier fantasy and found something quieter, more sobering. Not a grand reveal, just the everyday truth, laid out plainly and without flourish. In a way, it's comforting, because history, in its truest form, doesn't ask for spectacle. It just exists, and the lives of those who lived through it were not extraordinary in the way stories make them seem. They were tired, they were trying, they were surviving. The saloon, for all its rough glamour, was just a place where people gathered to numb something. Loneliness, hunger, fear, restlessness. And while the music might have played and the laughter might have rung out across the dusty street for a moment, the quiet always came back, just like it does now. That quiet, the stillness after all the noise, is maybe the most honest part of the story. Not the shootouts, not the poker hands, not even the whispered promises of redemption whispered between strangers in the dark. Just silence. The kind that settles after the last drink is poured and the lights burn low. The kind that says, in its own way, it's time to rest. Even now, long after the last lamplight flickered out in the western night, the shape of the saloon has never quite disappeared. Its name may have changed, its walls rebuilt with concrete and LED instead of timber and tallow, but its spirit lingers, reshaped, redistributed, humming softly beneath the surface of modern life. The music is louder now, the lights more choreographed, the menus far more curated. But the purpose, in many ways, remains eerily familiar. People still gather for comfort, for escape, for the warmth of being surrounded by noise when silence feels too heavy. We call them bars now, nightclubs, lounges. Some are sleek, clean, and controlled. Others spill out onto city sidewalks with a kind of restless energy that's hard to define. They hum with laughter, with flirtation, with posturing and ritual. And though the piano player's been replaced by playlists and DJs, and the whiskey is less likely to be cut with turpentine, the mechanics of connection have hardly changed at all. There's still the ritual of entry, an unspoken scan of the room, a flicker of self-awareness, the sudden recalibration of how you stand, how you speak. There's still the slow, deliberate dulling of edges as drinks are poured, one after another. Still the search for someone who might listen, or forget with you, or simply be near enough to distract from the quiet ache that many carry without ever naming it. In some places, the glamour is just as much a mask as the mirror-backed bars of old, a distraction from the loneliness that creeps in between conversation and chorus. And like the saloons of old, today's nightlife still carries its own contradictions. A place to feel alive and sometimes a place to disappear. For some, it offers community, celebration, even freedom. For others, it becomes a pattern, a trap, something harder to leave behind than it was to enter. The faces are younger, maybe, the clothes flashier, but the ache is familiar. The stories, if you listen closely enough, still rhyme. You might find someone laughing too hard at the bar, covering something, or someone sitting alone, scrolling absently, untethered from the energy around them. You might hear the bravado of a group building itself into confidence with each round, echoing the rough camaraderie that once rang out beneath saloon chandeliers. And in the corners, yes, even now, you'll find those who do the work. The bartenders, the servers, the ones who catch slurred apologies and mop up the spills no one notices. The invisible labor behind the nightly show hasn't changed much. Neither has the imbalance. But unlike the frontier saloon, which stood often in moral isolation at the edge of law and civility, today's nightlife lives in dialogue with a more complex, aware world. Conversations around consent, addiction, equity, Things left unspoken or unheard a century ago have found stronger voices. There are support systems now, sometimes, safer spaces, a recognition, at least in some corners, of the responsibility that comes with hosting human vulnerability. These are the lessons history offers when we choose to listen. And yet, even with that awareness, we still circle the same fires. Still use lights and laughter to hold back the dark. Because what those old saloons offered, and what modern nightlife still promises, is something deeply human. A place to momentarily suspend the ordinary. To feel braver, or freer, or simply less alone. Maybe that's why the myth survived. Not because it lied, but because it told a softer version of something we still need. So as the music quiets and the stories of the past recede into shadow, there's a kind of comfort in knowing that human needs, connection, escape, meaning, have always found expression, even in the grittiest of places. And maybe, in recognizing the cycles, in seeing how much hasn't changed, we can rest a little easier. The saloon isn't gone. It's just dressed differently. Its lessons, though often ignored, still echo faintly in the clink of a glass, in the silence that comes after last call.